Sometimes the people carrying the biggest secrets are the ones sleeping in the cold. The wind howled through the streets of Millbrook, Wyoming, pushing loose snow across the empty sidewalks like waves rolling over a frozen sea. Most businesses along Main Street had already shut their lights off for the night, except for Carter's Grocery, where the old neon sign still buzzed weakly against the dark. Caleb Mercer stepped out of his pickup truck, boots crunching over ice as he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. It had been a 14-hour day repairing generators outside Jackson Ridge, and the cold had settled deep into his bones. All he wanted was black coffee, canned soup, and maybe 30 minutes of silence before returning to the small cabin he shared with his 9-year-old daughter. But before he reached the store entrance, shouting cut through the wind. "Hey, you think you can steal from me and walk away?" Caleb turned sharply. Near the edge of the parking lot stood a small boy no older than 8, thin beneath an oversized winter coat, clutching a loaf of bread against his chest like it was treasure. The store owner gripped the child's arm tightly, his face red with frustration. "Please," the boy whispered, trembling. "My mom hasn't eaten since yesterday." "Then maybe your mom should pay like everyone else," the owner snapped. Snow whipped between them. A few people exiting the diner nearby slowed down just enough to stare before continuing to their cars. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody ever did. Caleb exhaled slowly and walked across the lot. "Let him go," he said quietly. The owner looked over. "Mind your business, Mercer." Caleb's tired eyes settled on the boy first. Pale cheeks, chapped lips, fear buried under dignity. The kind of look children got when they learned too young not to cry in public. Caleb reached into his wallet and placed 2 folded 20s onto the counter beside the entrance. "That should cover the bread, and whatever else they need." The owner muttered something under his breath, but released the child. The boy stumbled backward, clutching the loaf tightly. Then suddenly, out of the shadows beside the alley, a woman appeared. She moved fast, almost panicked, wrapping one arm protectively around the boy before looking up at Caleb with guarded gray eyes. She looked exhausted. Snow clung to her dark blonde hair, and her coat was too thin for the Wyoming winter. But there was something strange about her posture, something composed beneath the fear, like grace that had been dragged through years of survival, but never fully broken. "We don't want trouble," she said softly. Caleb shook his head. "Doesn't look to me like you were looking for any." The woman hesitated. The little boy tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered. "I said I could fix it." Her expression cracked for half a second, pain flickering across her face before disappearing again. Caleb noticed the boy's hands were red from cold. He glanced toward the dark highway stretching beyond town. Another storm was coming. He could feel it in the wind. "You got somewhere warm tonight?" he asked. The woman didn't answer. She only lowered her eyes. That was answer enough. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck and looked toward his truck. "I've got a cabin about 10 miles outside town," he said carefully. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm." The woman stiffened immediately. Fear, distrust, survival instincts sharpened by too many bad people. Caleb understood that look too. "One night," he added gently. "That's all I'm offering." Silence stretched between them while snow drifted beneath the flickering grocery sign. Then the boy coughed hard into his sleeve, his small body shaking from the cold. The woman closed her eyes briefly, like someone losing a battle with pride. "Claire," she said quietly. "My name is Claire." Caleb nodded once. "Caleb." The little boy looked up at him carefully. "I'm Noah." Caleb opened the passenger door of the truck. Warm air spilled into the freezing night. Noah climbed in first. Claire followed slowly, still tense, still watching everything around her like she expected danger to come roaring out of the dark at any moment. As she pulled the sleeve of her coat higher, the dim parking lot light caught something near her wrist. A faded bruise, thin marks circling the skin like old restraints. Caleb said, "Nothing." But as he shut the truck door against the storm, something deep inside him whispered that this woman was not just running from poverty. She was running from someone. The drive back to Caleb Mercer's cabin was quiet except for the steady groan of snow against the truck and the low hum of the heater struggling against the Wyoming cold. Headlights cut through the darkness in long pale beams while pine trees drifted past, like silent shadows standing guard over the mountains. Noah sat curled against the passenger door, clutching the loaf of bread tightly in both hands, as if letting go of it might somehow make the night less real. Claire barely moved beside him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the side mirror every few seconds, watching the empty highway behind them like she expected another set of headlights to appear at any moment. Caleb noticed it without saying anything. People who lived in fear developed habits like that. Quiet habits. The kind nobody saw unless they had once carried fear themselves. 20 minutes later, the truck rolled onto a narrow gravel road leading through a forest of snow-covered pines. At the end stood a small cabin with warm yellow light glowing softly through frosted windows. Smoke curled from the chimney into the dark winter sky. Noah stared at it carefully. "You live here?" he asked in a voice almost too small to hear. Caleb nodded once. "Me and my daughter." The boy looked surprised by that. "You have a kid too?" Caleb gave a faint smile. 9 years old. Talks more than a radio station. For the first time that night, Noah almost smiled. Inside, the cabin warmth wrapped around them immediately. The scent of burning cedar and chicken soup lingered in the air, while an old country song played softly from a radio near the kitchen sink. A pair of tiny winter boots sat beside the fireplace next to scattered crayons and a half-finished school project made from popsicle sticks. Claire froze near the doorway like someone who had forgotten what safety felt like. Then footsteps hurried across the hallway. "Dad." Sadie Mercer appeared wearing oversized flannel pajamas and thick wool socks. Her long blonde braid hung over one shoulder, and she stopped instantly when she saw the strangers standing inside the cabin. Caleb removed his gloves slowly. These folks needed somewhere warm tonight. Sadie looked first at Noah, then at Claire, and something gentle softened in her expression almost immediately. Children understood loneliness faster than adults did. "Hi," she said quietly. Noah shifted awkwardly. "Hi." Caleb moved toward the stove. "Soup is still warm if anybody wants some." Claire opened her mouth to refuse automatically, but Noah's stomach growled loud enough for everyone to hear. Sadie tried not to laugh. Instead, she walked to the kitchen cabinet, grabbed an extra bowl, and placed it carefully beside her own. "This one does not have any cracks," she told Noah seriously. "Dad says guests get the good bowls." Noah stared at her for a second before nodding slowly. "Thanks." They ate mostly in silence while snow tapped gently against the cabin windows. Caleb watched Claire from the corner of his eye. Even exhausted, even wearing worn clothes and cheap gloves with frayed stitching, she carried herself differently. The way she held silverware. The way she quietly corrected Noah's posture at the table without speaking. Grace hidden beneath survival. Sadie eventually disappeared into her room and returned carrying an old stuffed bear with one button eye missing. She placed it beside Noah carefully. "You can borrow him tonight," she whispered. Noah looked stunned. "Really? His name is Captain," she said proudly. "He protects people during storms." Something inside Claire seemed to break at that moment. She turned her face away quickly, blinking hard while pretending to look toward the fire. Caleb pretended not to notice. Some dignity deserved privacy. An hour later, Noah fell asleep on the couch beneath heavy quilts, clutching the stuffed bear against his chest. Caleb stood near the wood stove adding another log when he heard Claire whisper softly from across the room. "Thank you." He looked over. The firelight flickered across her tired face, and for the first time since meeting her, the fear in her eyes weakened just enough to reveal exhaustion underneath it. Caleb nodded once. "Everybody deserves one warm night." Claire lowered her gaze. Then suddenly Noah stirred in his sleep. His small fingers tightened around the blanket as he murmured weakly into the quiet cabin. "Mom, what if they find us again?" The room went still. Outside, the wind howled harder against the trees. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in pale gray light and the soft crackle of cedar burning inside the wood stove. Snow blanketed the valley outside Caleb Mercer's cabin in smooth, untouched waves, while frost clung to the windows like delicate lace. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Noah slept deeply. Curled beneath thick quilts on the couch with Sadie's stuffed bear tucked beneath his arm, he looked less like a frightened runaway and more like an ordinary little boy who finally felt safe enough to rest. Caleb stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee into chipped ceramic mugs while the smell of pancakes drifted through the cabin. He noticed Claire sitting near the fireplace, already dressed, her posture straight despite the exhaustion still shadowing her face. Most people waking after a freezing night outdoors would have looked relieved. Claire looked alert, listening, waiting, like peace itself felt temporary. Sadie bounced into the kitchen with messy hair and socks that did not match. Dad burned the first pancake again, she announced proudly. Caleb pointed a spatula at her. That was intentional quality testing. Noah stirred awake slowly at the sound of laughter. For a second, confusion crossed his face before memory returned and his shoulders tightened automatically. Then Sadie handed him a plate stacked with pancakes shaped vaguely like snowmen. The ugly one is yours, she informed him. Noah stared down at the plate. Nobody ever made me pancakes shaped like anything before. Sadie shrugged. Dad makes dinosaurs too, but they look like potatoes. Caleb shook his head while Claire lowered her eyes, hiding what looked dangerously close to tears again. Breakfast passed softly, the kind of quiet morning that healed something without announcing it. Caleb noticed Noah eating carefully, politely, never taking too much. Children who had known hunger always moved that way around food. Afterward, Sadie dragged Noah toward the living room to show him her collection of old comic books, while Caleb stepped outside to split wood before the next storm rolled in. The mountain air bit sharply against his skin as he carried fresh logs toward the porch. When he returned inside 30 minutes later, he stopped near the hallway. Claire sat at the old kitchen table with Caleb's battered laptop open in front of her. Earlier that week, the screen had started freezing every few minutes, and Caleb had nearly thrown the thing into a snowbank out of frustration. But now lines of code moved quickly across the monitor while Claire typed calmly with astonishing speed. Caleb blinked. You know computers? Claire looked up immediately, almost guilty at being caught. It was running outdated security drivers, she said quietly. And your firewall settings were exposed. Caleb stared at her. I understood maybe 3 words in that sentence. For the first time, a faint smile touched her face. Small, careful, like a person remembering how to smile after years without reason. It should work now. Caleb walked closer and tested the keyboard. The laptop responded instantly, faster than it had in years. He let out a low whistle. You fixed that in half an hour? Claire closed the screen gently. I used to work around systems like this. Around systems? Caleb repeated. She hesitated. Corporate infrastructure, security management, things like that. The answer sounded polished. Too polished. Not rehearsed exactly, but controlled. Like someone carefully opening one door while hiding 10 others behind it. Before Caleb could respond, soft music drifted from the old radio beside the sink. A classical piano piece filled the cabin, warm and elegant against the crackling fire. Claire turned instinctively toward the sound. Chopin, she whispered absent-mindedly. Nocturne in E-flat major. Caleb raised an eyebrow. You recognized that fast. Claire went still. My father used to play it. Silence settled gently between them while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Then suddenly Noah rushed into the kitchen holding one of Sadie's comic books. Mom, look, he said excitedly. This guy hides his identity too. The words slipped out naturally before the boy froze. Claire's expression changed instantly. Fear flickered behind her eyes again. Not panic. Something colder. Older. Caleb watched both of them carefully now. The expensive vocabulary. The flawless manners. The technology knowledge. The classical music. None of it belonged to the story of a homeless woman sleeping under bridges in Wyoming. And deep down, Caleb Mercer began to realize one dangerous truth. Claire was not simply hiding from the world. She was hiding from a world that once belonged to her. By the 4th night, the cabin no longer felt as quiet as it used to. Sadie's laughter drifted through the hallways more often now, mixing with the sound of Noah's cautious voice and the soft crackle of firewood burning inside the old stove. Outside, snow continued falling across the Wyoming Valley in slow silver waves, covering the pine trees and fences until the entire mountain road looked untouched by the world. But peace has a strange way of frightening people who are used to running. Caleb Mercer noticed it most after dark. Every single evening, right around midnight, Claire would stop whatever she was doing and glance toward the windows. Listening. Waiting. Sometimes she checked the front door lock twice. Sometimes 3 times. And every time headlights passed somewhere far down the mountain road, her entire body stiffened before the sound disappeared again into the storm. Caleb pretended not to notice. Dignity mattered, especially for wounded people. That night the wind rattled the cabin harder than usual, while Sadie and Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, building a crooked blanket fort beside the fireplace. Caleb worked quietly at the kitchen counter repairing a portable heater for one of the neighboring ranches. Claire stood near the sink washing dishes in silence, sleeves rolled carefully to her elbows. Then suddenly, headlights swept across the cabin windows. Bright, slow, deliberate. Claire froze so fast the ceramic plate slipped from her hands and cracked inside the sink. Noah looked up immediately. Fear flashed across his face before he even turned toward the glass. "Mom," he whispered. The headlights disappeared. Silence followed. Caleb walked calmly toward the front window and looked outside through the curtain. Nothing except snow drifting across the trees and the empty road leading down the mountain. But when he turned back around, Claire was already locking the deadbolt again with trembling hands. "Claire," Caleb said gently, "nobody is here." "You do not know that," she replied too quickly. The room fell quiet. Sadie lowered the blanket she had been holding while Noah stared down at the floor. Claire closed her eyes briefly, ashamed of the fear in her own voice. "I am sorry," she whispered. She stopped herself. Caleb stepped closer, keeping his tone calm. "Who are you afraid of?" Claire looked at him for a long moment without answering. Firelight flickered softly across her face, catching exhaustion beneath the sharp edges of survival she wore like armor. "People with resources," she finally said. "People who do not stop looking." Caleb leaned against the wall quietly. "That sounds expensive." A faint breath escaped her, almost a laugh, but not quite. Before she could answer, Noah suddenly stood up from the floor. "We should leave," he said quickly, "before they find us again." Sadie blinked in confusion. "Who is finding you?" Noah looked at his mother immediately, realizing too late he had spoken out loud. Claire moved toward him fast, kneeling gently beside him. "Nobody is finding us tonight," she said softly, brushing snowflake-damp hair away from his forehead. "You are safe." But the little boy did not look convinced. Caleb watched them carefully now. This was more than homelessness, more than bad luck. Fear that deep usually came from power, the kind of power ordinary people never touched. An hour later, the children finally fell asleep inside the blanket fort while the storm thickened outside. Caleb covered them with extra quilts before stepping quietly onto the front porch with a cup of coffee warming his hands. Snow drifted across the dark mountains in soft silence beneath the pale glow of moonlight. A few moments later, the front door creaked open behind him. Claire stepped outside, wearing one of Caleb's old flannel jackets over her sweater. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cold air carried only the distant whistle of wind through pine branches. Then Claire finally broke the silence. "You should not trust me so easily." Caleb stared out toward the valley below. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I trust the way your son looks at you." Claire lowered her eyes. "And how does he look at me?" Caleb took a slow sip of coffee. "Like you are the only safe place he has left." Something fragile moved across her face then. Not fear this time. Grief. Deep and old and carefully hidden. Inside the cabin, the old radio suddenly crackled through the silence. A late-night news station drifted softly into the winter air. Then a voice spoke clearly through the static. "Authorities are still searching for missing Whitmore global heiress Claire Whitmore and her young son after nearly 8 years." Claire stopped breathing. And for the first time since Caleb met her, the truth finally had a name. The radio continued humming softly inside the cabin long after the announcer's voice faded into static, but nobody moved. Snow swept across the porch in restless waves while the winter wind whispered through the pines surrounding the valley. Claire Whitmore stood frozen near the doorway, her face drained of color beneath the pale porch light. Caleb Mercer looked at her quietly, not with judgment, not with fear, but with the steady expression of a man trying to understand where truth ended and pain began. Inside, the fire cracked softly while Sadie and Noah slept beneath tangled blankets on the living room floor, unaware that the silence around them had just changed forever. Claire lowered her eyes first. "I did not want you to hear it like that," she whispered. Caleb leaned against the porch railing slowly. "I figured your story was bigger than what you told me." She gave a weak nod, wrapping his flannel jacket tighter around herself against the cold. Bigger does not always mean better. The mountain air hung between them, sharp with snow and cedar smoke. For a long moment Claire said nothing at all. Then finally, in a voice almost too tired to carry, she spoke. "Again, Whitmore Global was my father's company. Shipping, real estate, aviation, technology. By the time I was 28, Reporters called him one of the most powerful men in America. Caleb stayed quiet. Claire looked out toward the dark valley below. People think wealth protects you, she continued softly. Sometimes it only gives dangerous people better reasons to lie. A branch creaked somewhere deep in the forest. Inside the cabin, Noah shifted in his sleep. Claire's eyes flicked instantly toward the sound before settling again. 8 years ago, my father died unexpectedly. Caleb noticed the careful choice of words. Unexpectedly. Not peacefully. Not naturally. After the funeral, Claire continued, my Uncle Graham took control of the company temporarily. At least that was the story presented to the public. She laughed once under her breath, bitter and hollow. Temporary became permanent very quickly. Caleb folded his arms against the cold. And you? Claire looked down at her hands. The newspapers said I was unstable, emotional, unfit to lead after grief. Her voice remained calm, but Caleb could hear the old wound beneath it. Then they said I disappeared. Did you? Caleb asked gently. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. No, I ran. The fire inside popped loudly, scattering sparks behind the cabin windows. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. I found financial records my father had hidden. Offshore accounts, illegal transfers, names connected to politicians and shell companies. Her eyes darkened with memory. The deeper I looked, the more frightened my father became before he died. Caleb studied her carefully now. This was no longer a story about inheritance. This was survival. You think your uncle was involved? He asked quietly. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the sleeping children inside the cabin. I think my father knew something dangerous, she finally whispered. And I think he tried to protect Noah before it was too late. Caleb frowned slightly. Protect Noah? Claire nodded once. Noah is my father's only biological grandson. Legally, that makes him heir to everything. The words settled heavily into the cold night air. Caleb let out a slow breath. Billions of dollars. International companies. Power large enough to erase people quietly if it needed to. And somehow all of it had led to a frightened little boy sleeping beneath homemade quilts inside a tiny Wyoming cabin. So all these years, Caleb began carefully. Claire finished the sentence for him. We kept moving. Her voice cracked slightly now despite her effort to control it. Cheap motels, shelters, bus stations, anywhere people stopped asking questions. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. That is not living. Claire stared toward the snowy darkness. No, she admitted softly. It is surviving. Silence settled again between them, deep and heavy as falling snow. Then suddenly headlights appeared far down the mountain road below. Slow, bright, moving carefully through the storm toward the cabin. Claire's entire body stiffened instantly. Fear flooded her eyes before the truck even reached the driveway. Caleb followed her gaze toward the approaching lights. A black SUV emerged through the snow like a shadow climbing the mountain. And this time, it did not drive past. The black SUV rolled slowly through the falling snow until its headlights washed across the front of Caleb Mercer's cabin like pale searchlights cutting through darkness. The engine idled quietly beneath the storm while icy wind drifted across the porch in restless spirals. Claire Whitmore stopped breathing for a moment. Caleb could feel it beside him. Fear had a sound when it became deep enough. Not screaming, not panic. Silence. Pure silence. Inside the cabin, the children still slept near the fire, unaware that the world Claire had spent 8 years escaping had finally climbed the mountain road behind her. The driver's side door opened first. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark wool coat dusted with snowflakes. Another man followed from the passenger side, carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. Neither looked like police. Neither looked hurried. Men with power rarely rushed. Caleb remained still on the porch while Claire instinctively stepped backward toward the cabin door. Go inside, Caleb said quietly without looking at her. Caleb, go check on the kids. Something in his calm voice made her obey. Claire disappeared into the cabin just as the taller man climbed the porch steps. He removed his gloves carefully before speaking. Mr. Mercer? Caleb nodded once. Who is asking? The man offered a practiced professional smile that never reached his eyes. My name is Daniel Reeves. I represent Whitmore Global Holdings. Caleb folded his arms slowly. That sounds expensive. Reeves glanced briefly toward the cabin windows glowing warmly behind Caleb. We are looking for Claire Whitmore and her son. Snow tapped softly against the porch railing. Caleb did not move. And if you found them? Reeves remained composed. Miss Whitmore's family wishes to bring her home safely. Caleb almost smiled at the word safely. He had lived long enough to know that wealthy people often use gentle language to hide sharp intentions. Funny thing, Caleb said quietly. People who are safe usually do not spend 8 years hiding. The second man stepped forward slightly, clearly irritated. Sir, this is private corporate business. Caleb's eyes shifted toward him calmly. Then you should probably keep it private somewhere else. The mountain wind carried silence between them while snow drifted across the porch light. Reeves studied Caleb more carefully now, noticing the old military posture perhaps, the controlled stillness, the kind of calm that did not come from weakness. Inside the cabin, Claire stood near the hallway, clutching Noah protectively, while Sadie peeked nervously from behind the couch. Noah's face had turned pale the moment he saw the SUV. Mom, he whispered shakily. It is them. Claire knelt quickly beside him. Listen to me, she said softly. Nobody is taking you anywhere tonight. But even as she said the words, fear trembled beneath them. Caleb heard movement behind the door and made his decision quietly. They are not leaving with you, he said firmly toward the men outside. Reeves sighed almost regretfully. Mr. Mercer, you do not understand the situation. Then explain it. Reeves looked toward the snowy road before lowering his voice. Whitmore Global is preparing a transition of executive leadership. Claire Whitmore's return complicates certain legal matters. Caleb stared at him. Legal matters. Inheritance structures. Shareholder confidence. Public stability. Caleb gave a slow nod. So this is about money. Reeves hesitated for half a second too long. That was answer enough. Caleb stepped closer now, boots creaking against the wooden porch beneath him. There is a little boy inside this cabin, he said quietly. Cold. Tired. Scared of people in black SUVs. His eyes hardened slightly for the first time that night. That tells me everything I need to know. The second man moved again, impatient now. Sir, if Miss Whitmore refuses cooperation, there may be consequences. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Was that supposed to sound like a threat? Snow swirled heavily between them while the porch light flickered against the storm. Reeves quickly lifted one hand toward his partner, stopping him before things escalated further. Then the older man looked back at Caleb differently. More carefully this time. You were military, Reeves observed quietly. Caleb did not answer. Reeves nodded faintly anyway. I thought so. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then finally Reeves reached into his coat pocket and removed a business card, placing it gently on the porch railing. Tell Claire this, he said softly. Her uncle knows she is alive now. The wind howled harder through the pines. Reeves stepped backward toward the SUV. And next time, he added carefully, the people who come looking may not be as patient as we are. The door shut. The engine growled softly. Then the black SUV disappeared back down the mountain road, its taillights fading slowly into the snowstorm below. Caleb remained standing on the porch long after the vehicle vanished. Behind him, inside the warm cabin light, Claire Whitmore quietly began to cry. The storm finally eased sometime before dawn, leaving the valley wrapped in a silence so deep it almost felt sacred. Snow covered the mountain road in smooth white layers while pale morning light drifted slowly across Caleb Mercer's cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low during the night, leaving soft amber shadows dancing against the wooden walls. But nobody had slept much. Claire Whitmore sat alone at the kitchen table staring into a mug of untouched coffee while Noah remained curled beneath blankets on the couch beside Sadie's stuffed bear. Every few minutes the little boy glanced nervously toward the windows as though expecting another black SUV to appear through the snow at any second. Caleb stood near the stove fixing breakfast quietly, giving fear room to breathe without forcing conversation onto it. Sometimes kindness looked like silence. Finally Claire spoke. You should ask us to leave. Caleb flipped a pancake calmly. That your professional recommendation? Claire looked exhausted. Caleb, you do not understand how dangerous this is. He slid a plate onto the counter. I understand a child should not have to live scared all the time. Her eyes lowered immediately. The words struck harder because they were true. Sadie wandered sleepily into the kitchen, rubbing one eye. Are the scary businessmen gone? She asked. Caleb nodded once. For now. Noah sat up quickly. They always come back. The room grew quiet again. Caleb noticed Claire close her eyes briefly, carrying the weight of her son's fear like a wound she could never fully heal. Sadie climbed onto the couch beside Noah carefully. "My dad says storms always sound bigger at night," she whispered. "But morning makes them smaller." Noah stared at her for a second before giving the faintest nod. Children had a strange way of offering hope without even realizing it. Later that afternoon, Caleb drove into town for supplies, while Claire stayed behind with the children. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he entered Miller's Hardware near Main Street. The little bell above the door chimed softly, but the moment Caleb stepped inside, conversation stopped. Three men near the coffee machine glanced toward him before quickly looking away. Old Mrs. Donnelly at the register gave him a worried expression. "You got company up there on the mountain last night," she said carefully. Caleb kept his tone neutral. "Word travels fast." She lowered her voice. "Black SUVs usually mean lawyers or trouble." Caleb almost smiled. Sometimes both. But as he moved through town gathering supplies, he felt it everywhere now. Eyes lingering too long. Whispered conversations stopping when he walked by. Fear disguised as curiosity. By evening, the rumors had already spread through Millbrook. Caleb Mercer was hiding the missing Whitmore heiress. Wealth had a scent people recognized, even from far away. When Caleb returned to the cabin just after sunset, he found Noah and Sadie sitting cross-legged near the fireplace, while Claire stared at an old photograph spread across the kitchen table. She quickly reached to cover it the moment Caleb entered, but not before he saw the image clearly. A younger Claire standing beside an older silver-haired man in front of a skyscraper, carrying the Whitmore Global logo. Her father. Caleb placed grocery bags onto the counter quietly. "You miss him?" Claire looked down at the photo beneath trembling fingers. "Every day." Firelight flickered softly across the room while snow tapped against the windows again. After a long silence, Claire finally spoke in a voice so quiet Caleb almost did not hear it. "The night my father died, he gave me something." Noah looked up immediately. Claire turned toward her son gently. "Go get Captain." The little boy hesitated only briefly before running toward the couch and returning with Sadie's old stuffed bear clutched tightly in his arms. Caleb frowned slightly. Claire carefully opened the small seam near the bear's missing button eye and reached inside. Then slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a tiny silver USB drive wrapped in plastic. Caleb stared at it. Noah held his breath. Claire's voice trembled softly. "My father hid evidence before he died. Financial records. Internal files. Private recordings." Her eyes filled with old grief. Proof that Graham was stealing from the company for years. Caleb looked at the tiny device resting in her hand. Such a small thing to carry so much fear. "Then why not go to the police?" he asked quietly. Claire laughed bitterly under her breath. "Because powerful people prepare for that." She looked toward the fire. Witnesses disappeared. Reporters changed stories overnight. Lawyers stopped. Returning calls. Her eyes lifted toward Caleb again. Every person who tried helping us eventually became afraid. Silence settled heavily across the cabin. Then Noah suddenly spoke from beside the fire. "You are not afraid." Caleb looked at the little boy for a long moment before answering. "Everybody gets afraid, Noah." The child frowned slightly. "Then why did you help us?" Caleb glanced toward Claire quietly, toward the exhaustion in her eyes, toward the years of running written into her silence. Then he answered with the kind of calm truth only decent men know how to carry. "Because being scared is not the same thing as walking away." Claire lowered her face into trembling hands. And for the first time in 8 years, she finally allowed herself to believe they might not be alone anymore. 3 days later, the snowstorm finally broke, revealing sharp blue skies stretched wide above the Wyoming mountains like fresh hope after a long season of darkness. But inside Caleb Mercer's cabin, tension still lived quietly in every room. Claire Whitmore barely slept anymore. Every passing engine on the distant road made her glance toward the windows. Every unknown number calling Caleb's phone tightened the fear already sitting behind her eyes. Yet somehow, despite all of it, life inside the cabin had begun forming small pieces of normal again. Sadie taught Noah how to stack pancakes without making them collapse. Noah helped Caleb repair a broken fence post near the barn. Claire even laughed once that morning when Sadie spilled flour across the kitchen counter trying to bake biscuits. It was soft, brief, but real. Caleb noticed it immediately because broken people rarely laughed unless healing had quietly begun. Then the phone rang. The old cordless phone buzzed sharply across the kitchen counter, cutting through the warm smell of coffee and cedar smoke. Caleb answered carefully. Mercer speaking. A calm male voice answered. Mr. Mercer. Daniel Reeves. Claire looked up instantly from across the room. Fear returned to her expression so fast, it almost hurt to watch. Caleb stayed calm. Thought you lawyers preferred emails. Reeves ignored the remark. There's going to be an emergency shareholder meeting in New York tomorrow morning. Graham Whitmore intends to finalize permanent executive control of Whitmore Global. Claire stood slowly now, pale, silent. Reeves continued. If Claire wants any chance to stop him, this is likely the last opportunity. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. And why are you telling us this? Several seconds passed before Reeves answered quietly. Because not everyone inside Whitmore Global still believes Graham deserves to win. The line disconnected. Silence settled across the kitchen. Outside, wind moved softly through the pine trees while sunlight reflected off untouched snow like fields of glass. Claire looked down at the table. It is over, she whispered. I cannot fight people like that anymore. Caleb studied her carefully. Maybe not alone. She laughed weakly under her breath. You really think a mechanic from Wyoming can walk into a Manhattan boardroom and stop billionaires? Caleb poured another cup of coffee calmly. No, he admitted. But I think truth can. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and fear. Caleb borrowed his neighbor's truck to drive them to Jackson Hole Airport, while Sadie packed Noah's stuffed bear carefully into a backpack beside the hidden USB drive. Claire barely spoke during the flight to New York. She sat near the window, gripping the armrest quietly as clouds rolled beneath the plane like frozen oceans. Caleb noticed how Noah kept leaning gently against her shoulder every few minutes, reminding her without words that she was not running anymore. Manhattan greeted them with steel towers, winter rain, and streets pulsing with noise even after sunset. Everything felt louder there. Faster. Harder. Caleb stood outside Whitmore Global headquarters the following morning, staring up at the massive glass skyscraper disappearing into gray clouds above the city. Men in tailored suits hurried past without noticing him. Claire stopped walking for a moment. Fear returned again. I cannot do this, she whispered. Caleb looked at her calmly. Yes, you can. She shook her head slightly. You do not understand. These people destroyed my entire life. Caleb's voice remained quiet. Then maybe it is time they finally explain why. The shareholder meeting filled an enormous conference hall lined with polished marble and glowing screens displaying the Whitmore Global logo. Executives murmured across long rows of tables, while reporters clustered near the back waiting for Graham Whitmore's official takeover announcement. The moment Claire entered beside Caleb, the entire room shifted. Whispers spread instantly through the crowd like electricity. Some people stared in shock. Others looked frightened. Graham Whitmore stood near the center stage in a charcoal suit, silver hair perfectly styled, confidence resting across his face like armor built from years of control. But when he saw Claire alive beside a man in worn Wyoming boots holding a little boy's hand, something flickered behind his smile for the first time. Uncertainty. Claire, Graham said smoothly into the stunned silence. What a surprise. Claire froze beside Caleb. Her breathing turned shallow. Cameras flashed across the room. Reporters leaned forward. Graham opened his arms carefully like a grieving relative welcoming family home. We have all been worried about you for years. Caleb felt Noah's small hand tighten around his own. The boy looked terrified. Then suddenly Noah stepped forward before anyone could stop him. Quietly, carefully, holding Sadie's stuffed bear against his chest. The entire room watched in confusion as the little boy reached into the bear's torn seam and removed the tiny silver USB drive hidden inside. And for the first time that morning, Graham Whitmore's smile disappeared completely. The conference hall fell so quiet that even the soft hum of projectors seemed suddenly loud. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the tiny silver USB drive resting in Noah Whitmore's trembling hand, while flashes from cameras lit the room in cold bursts of white. Graham Whitmore stood frozen near the stage, the confidence he carried moments earlier draining slowly from his expression. Beside him, executives shifted uneasily in their chairs while reporters leaned forward with sharpened attention. Caleb Mercer remained near the back of the room beside Claire, one steady hand resting lightly against her shoulder. He could feel her shaking, not from weakness, from the unbearable weight of finally stopping after 8 years of running. Noah looked up toward his great-uncle with frightened but determined eyes. My grandfather said this was for when the truth stopped being safe. He whispered softly into the silence. The room did not move. A legal assistant hurried toward the front stage and inserted the USB drive into the presentation system, while Graham's attorneys immediately rose in protest. This meeting cannot proceed with unauthorized material, one snapped sharply. But before anyone could disconnect the screen, an old video file opened automatically across the massive display above the shareholders. The image flickered once. Then a silver-haired man appeared seated behind a wooden office desk. Older, tired, but unmistakably powerful. Claire's breath caught instantly. "Dad," she whispered. The recording timestamp showed a date from 8 years earlier, only 3 days before his death. The older man looked directly into the camera with heavy eyes. "If you are watching this," he began quietly, "then it means I was right to be afraid." A wave of silence rolled through the hall. Reporters stopped typing. Executives stopped whispering. Even Graham Whitmore no longer moved. The man on screen continued calmly. "My brother Graham has been using Whitmore Global Resources through offshore entities without board authorization. I have gathered financial proof and internal records." Documents appeared beside the video feed. Account numbers, transactions, secret agreements signed under false companies. The room erupted into stunned murmurs before instantly falling silent again when the older man spoke once more. "If anything happens to me, my daughter Claire must protect Noah. He is the rightful heir to Whitmore Global, and he deserves a future untouched by corruption." Claire covered her mouth with trembling hands as tears streamed silently down her face. Across the room, Graham Whitmore staggered backward slightly, his polished image collapsing beneath the truth spreading across every screen in America at that very moment. One shareholder stood abruptly. "Is this real?" Another voice answered immediately from the legal review table. "The documentation has already been verified." More executives rose now, some angry, others stunned. Cameras flashed rapidly across the hall, while reporters rushed toward the exits to break the story live. But Caleb noticed something else. Noah was no longer hiding behind his mother. The little boy stood quietly beside Claire with his shoulders straight for the first time since they met. Fear had not disappeared from him completely, but dignity had finally begun replacing it. Graham tried speaking once more into the chaos. "Claire, listen to me." But his words dissolved beneath the growing noise of legal advisors, shareholders, and security officers moving toward him. The room that once obeyed his power now turned away from him entirely. Caleb looked around the massive conference hall and realized something strange. Nobody was staring at Claire with suspicion anymore. Nobody saw a runaway heiress or unstable woman. They saw a mother who survived. And somehow that truth carried more power than billions ever could. 3 months later, winter began loosening its grip on the Wyoming mountains. Snow melted slowly along the fences surrounding Caleb Mercer's cabin, while soft sunlight spilled across the valley in long golden beams. The world felt quieter now, kinder somehow. Noah sat on the porch steps helping Caleb repair an old fishing pole, while Sadie laughed nearby, trying to teach Claire how to make proper hot chocolate the Wyoming way, which apparently involved too many marshmallows and absolutely no measuring cups. Claire looked different too. The fear in her eyes no longer arrived every time a car passed the road below. Her shoulders no longer carried survival like armor. Whitmore Global had officially returned to her control weeks earlier, but she spent more time in Wyoming than New York now. The skyscrapers could keep their polished glass and private elevators. Peace had found her somewhere much smaller. That evening, the four of them sat together beneath the porch lights wrapped in blankets, while spring wind moved softly through the pine trees. Noah leaned sleepily against Caleb's shoulder, while Sadie drew crooked constellations in a notebook beside the fire pit. Claire watched them quietly for a long moment before finally speaking. "Why did you help us?" she asked softly. "That first night. You thought we had nothing." Caleb stared out toward the fading mountains where snow still clung to distant peaks beneath the setting sun. Then he smiled faintly. "Because people are not measured by what they own." Claire lowered her eyes as emotion tightened her voice. Caleb looked toward Noah and Sadie laughing together beneath the porch light. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the people who need a home the most are the ones who stopped believing they deserved one." The wind carried silence gently through the valley after that. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of hiding. The kind of silence that only comes when wounded hearts finally understand they are safe. And beneath the warm glow of that small Wyoming porch, after years of running from power, money, and shadows, Claire Whitmore finally found the one thing billions could never buy: home.